here. This is the May edition of the Inclusive Management Series, Managers Series. We're really excited for you all to be here and to spend time with us. Thank you in advance for making time out of your day. This is a 1-hour webinar that's really an opportunity for us to focus on a specific topic and have some space to have a thought leader help us unpack some ideas around that particular topic and give us space as practitioners, as colleagues, as people who are really trying to create more kind of inclusion in our work environments to come together and to talk about opportunities for sharing practices and learning with and from each other. So thank you in advance for being here. I am going to make a couple of little housekeeping mentions. The first one is, and maybe Sarah, this would be a great time if you would turn on your, share your screen. What we have is a mural board that we're going to use. Are you able to share it? Or Tyler?
I've got it.
Okay, thank you, Tyler.
Yeah.
So we're going to use a mural board for this session. And mural is a tool that we often use to facilitate group discussions, because we have been using virtual discussion spaces so much over the last year. We are consistently trying to look for ways to increase engagement and to make sure that everybody has a really clear sense of how it is that they can kind of understand what the content is, set some expectations, and also feel like you have the ability to interact with the content and each other in multiple ways. So this mural board is something that we'll be using to facilitate us today. The link for the mural board is in the chat. So if you want to jump on in, you are absolutely welcome to. This is our shared space. We'd love to have you there. But if you don't want to jump into the mural board, no problem at all. We'll just share screens when we're focusing on a particular topic. And also we will adjust the zooming in function so you'll be able to follow along with where we are. So I've already mentioned that some of the goals of this session are to help us really think about how we connect around a particular topic and do some additional kind of ongoing work related to inclusive managerial practices and leadership. We also really encourage you to maximize the opportunity to connect with each other. There are hopefully people here from different industries, from different functional areas, from different levels and types of contribution in your organization. So we really encourage you to connect with each other. If you are able to, please turn on your camera. It's great to be able to have access, as full of access as possible. If you need or want to change your Zoom name so that it includes your organizational affiliation, the phonetic pronunciation of your name, your pronouns, anything at all, please go ahead and do that. And then we also ask you to mute unless you're speaking, but absolutely, if and when you want to speak throughout the session, use the raise your hand function so that we can identify you and absolutely make space for your contribution, okay? And when you do unmute, please tell us your name and your organization, and if you'd like your physical location, just to help us make the connections there, all right? The other thing that I'd like to suggest and say is that with us today is Sarah Segura and Lexi Seals, who are also part of the DJ team, who are going to be helping us drive the technical aspects. And also, if you have any issues related to kind of technical access, please reach out to either Sarah or Lexi. And Sarah and Lexi, thank you in advance for helping us get this just right. Today's focus, and I'll introduce our guest in just a moment. Today's focus is about how we show up in our organizations. As most of you have noticed, the world is shifting pretty rapidly. The way in which we have conversations about who we are, what we bring into our workplaces, how we function as individuals and as teams, how it is that we define what inclusion looks like behaviorally and structurally are more and more centered and expected us to have more proficiency around. For a lot of us, though, what that also means is that we are redefining the space between what was traditionally described as professional space and what is now, and what has also been described as personal space. And the two of those are blending in different ways. And there's a lot of kind of unearthing and interrogation and redefinition that's happening right now. And so this conversation today is really about creating space for us to talk about the dynamics associated with what used to sound like personal and professional as two different ways of interacting and two different normalized expectations for how it is that we contribute in a workplace, to really thinking about some of the changing expectations and what the implications of those changes are for us as leaders and managers and practitioners. With that said, I'd like to welcome our guest, who is going to bring a lot of wisdom to this conversation, and is also a dear friend and colleague at DJA, Tyler Zuba. Tyler is the Vice President of Learning and Organizational Development at DJA. And Tyler, welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, it's great to be here with you all. Thanks so much for coming up with the idea for this session, Dieta, and for inviting me to join for it.
Thank you. Thanks for being here. Tyler, before we get started, the last thing that I'll say is that I want everybody to know that this is a recorded session, and it will be available on our YouTube channel. So just know that we want you to bring your full generosity to this space, but also know that it's not a fully confidential space. So as long as you know that in advance and are okay with that, we want to make sure that you're here and bringing all of your ideas and contributions. With that said, Tyler, I'm going to kick off the conversation, and I'm just going to ask you to help us start thinking about this session. So, a couple of high-level questions. Why this topic? Why now? And then how is this issue of kind of personal sharing in the workplace relevant for those of us who are practitioners and managers and leaders?
Yeah, so, a couple of things that come to mind really to get us started here. Dieta, I think you really encapsulated a lot of the core issues, which are our contexts are changing, right? It used to be the case in a lot of industries, not universally and not in every culture, but in a lot of industries and a lot of cultures, that personal and professional were entirely separate. Right. And if I brought some of my personal self into the workplace, that was unprofessional and is still treated as unprofessional in a lot of ways. One of the things that I see happen quite a lot is we'll have people in an organization, and this is the way that it often happens, say that, well, those younger members of our organization, those millennials, the way it usually comes up, don't have that same personal versus professional divide. And I think that's true to some extent, but actually a lot more complicated in terms of how people bring themselves to the workplace, thinking of things like identity, like personal characteristics, like personal experiences, but also in the way that people feel safe to show up as their full selves. And we're seeing a lot of changing and shifting around that conversation. And I don't think that's changing just along generational lines. There's a lot of issues there around culture, around macro cultures. Here I am in Rochester, New York in the US as part of the US macro culture, but I'm also part of a microculture as part of the LGBTQ plus community. And so some of those elements, I have to sort of walk between cultures, and different cultures will have different standards and expectations for how we show up in our work. The other thing, which I know we've all really been dramatically thinking about, is over the last year and change, as we've gone from a lot of us working in person to almost all of us working remotely, who are on this call probably, to now figuring out how those things reconverge as a lot of us are going back to our physical workplaces. We've seen a lot of blurring of the lines. I don't think anyone has ever complained about a cat walking into frame, right? But we're also seeing, how are people juggling their family and child and elder care needs? How are people negotiating, can I show the space behind me? I know some of you have your cameras off because you don't want to show the space that's behind you, and that's 100% okay. But then we go back into those levels of professional conversation, right? When is it okay for me to leave my camera off? When is it expected that I have my camera on? So yeah, I think those are some of the things that are coming into play, and why we at DJA, I know I've been having this conversation in a lot of places. What do we bring of ourselves to the workplace? What is helpful? And what don't we, and why?
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Tyler. What about other folks as we maybe set the stage for this? And one of the things that would be helpful for us to do early on in this session is to go into maybe some breakout room discussions and have something that we can, prompts that we can use to generate some initial discussion. But before we do that, I'd love to create space for anyone else who has any other ideas or any context that might be helpful as we think about the topic that we're on today, really thinking about the changing nature of personal sharing that exists now in our workplaces and how those expectations are showing up for us. Anyone else have anything else to say about that?
I could say something.
Yes, please, Sage.
So I work with some people who are older, come from different cultures, and the thing that I hear a lot is, we're not here to make friends. Talking about, the supervisor employee relationship, and that just makes me think like, well, how do you treat your friends versus how do you treat your employees, and why does that have to be different?
Sage, I really appreciate you bringing that up, and it's great to see you here. That's a really interesting point. And the thing that really comes to mind for me, and I see a couple of people had also unmuted, and I want to get to you, but I want to highlight here that there's this expectation that sometimes comes up, which is I have to maintain a professional separation, right? And that, I think, has actually a lot of pluses and a lot of minuses, and that depends so much on the context, right? I'm going to operate in one way with, my peer at my organization, Maggie, who's another VP at DJA. I'm going to operate in a different way with people who I supervise, and I'm going to operate in a different way with Dieta, who runs my organization. And all of those power dynamics come into play. And there's also the sort of implication there that I hear, we're not here to make friends, which has a lot to do in my mind with, well, what are we here to do, if that's the case? And then to your point, right, how is that different? And it is different in a professional setting versus an explicitly non-professional setting. But those differences aren't necessarily universal. I saw some other people. Jeffrey, I saw you had your hand up, and there was someone else who unmuted.
Sure, I'll just talk really quickly about kind of a counter, not really a counterpoint, but a bit of a balance on what you were talking about around, keeping that professional versus private, but also some of it's generational. Where I work, I've got some people who have been in this place for a very long time, and then I've got some very new people. And there's also a bit of a generational difference. But this definition of time spent on work as well. So I've got some people who are really clear about, nope, when I'm done at night, I'm done at night. And I'm not touching things on the weekends. And then, I'm going to keep those boundaries pretty tight about that difference between my work time and my professional time, as well as other people who are, these people are not showing quite the same dedication. And as a leader, working to balance those two things, because neither one of them's wrong. It's just figuring out how to help people think about those things differently. And I, of course, as the leader, see things that maybe others don't, to be able to say, they're doing everything that they need to do. They may not be spending as much time right here as you might be, but that doesn't mean that they're not working any less than you are. If that makes sense.
That absolutely makes sense. Yeah. And one thing that I will probably come back to is that sense of comparison, right? That idea that, well, I see them, working at all hours of the day. Should I be doing that? Or I see that person, goofing off during the day, and I don't maybe have pictures into what they might be doing outside of quote normal business hours. And so are they slacking off? Am I being expected to do more than them? We'll definitely come back to that.
And Tyler, as an HR professional, I keep saying this, but we've been perpetrating this for a really long time. I mean, we've been telling people, don't delve into people's personal lives. Don't ask them personal questions. That may lead to things you don't want to know about or have to deal with. If you ask personal questions about somebody in an interview and you don't hire them, that might get used against you as an employer. So it's a really big shift in thinking for a lot of people, and HR being one of them. It's a very interesting dynamic. Don't get too deep. It's been the mantra for a really long time.
Tyler, and as you see my gorgeous basement that I'm working in right now, because I'm not meeting on my background since I'm permanently from home now. The one thing that I'd say is that this has been a really big conversation for my global organization. And the way that we're sort of tackling it, it's really about this idea of belonging, right? How can you ensure, as we're trying to create a culture of belonging, that colleagues can bring themselves to work? But there's a caveat to that, right? Not every colleague wants to talk about it. So that's the equity piece. How can you be respectful in understanding someone's point of view? But how can you also own your own individual behaviors to ensure that your behaviors are being inclusive of the individuals that are around you?
Reverend Greg.
Yes, thank you. And I think the woman who just spoke was right on point. And I know and I'll just talk from my position, I know for, being a Black man, and I've also had conversations with other Black and brown people around, that that thought process of, like, what are we here to do? Are we here to make friends or whatever? Is that it's been too costly for us to do that, because it has been used against us in punitive measures, and so, it depends on, just like the person just put in there, I think it may also depend on privilege and safety. And it hasn't been safe for us to show up as our whole selves or become friendly at the cost of surviving in our livelihood, right? And trying to, make a way and provide for our families and things like that. So here at the organization that I work for Human Service Organization in Western Massachusetts. Our whole mantra and our whole thing has always been creating a brave space for people to show up for their whole selves, and really trying to tear down those systematic processes of thought. But it's so ingrained, in just cultural, well, I wouldn't even say, let me back up for a minute. It's so ingrained in people's experience that when they come into an environment that says, hey, you can be your whole selves, you could do this, almost like, at what cost? Like, what is this, a setup? You know what I mean? Like, are you serious? Like, if I really showed up as my whole self, what's really going to happen? So I just wanted to add that as a caveat. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Gina.
Thanks. I'm so appreciating this conversation. This is very much a sort of leadership edge for me, where my whole career, I would say the way that I created and helped others to create respectful work environments is the idea that we all bow in and do the common work together and think about what the common goals are. So I think for me, there has been a really distinct boundary around our broader personal lives and all the dynamics that can go with that, and the place where we come in and identify the common goals that we have and bring all of our different forms of experience and expertise and thinking to bear on those shared goals. And I think, I really appreciate the comments that have come before me in that I think, for me, you can have a very warm relationship with colleagues and a very warm and respectful relationship, but that's different from bringing all of your personal self and stuff and, you know, wounds and dynamics and everything into the space. And I do think that that has meant that people with more privilege have been able to create a lot of weirdness and a lot of burden in the workspace if it's not pretty crisply respectful how we interact with each other. So I'm you know, I'm invested in figuring out how we bring our full selves and we don't create a culture that is monolithic. But I also am really invested in not treating the workplace as a community or a family, because those are very different places where you can let it all hang out in different ways that are not healthy in the environment where we're trying to find common ground and work together. So I'm loving this conversation and grateful for it.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Gina. And I really appreciate your care there towards allowing people, and this actually goes back to what Reverend Greg just said, letting people define what they want to bring to the space. Such an important thing, both for personal, for collective, and for historical reasons, as we've pointed to. You know, one thing that comes to mind for me here is how we create a space of invitation and recognition of safety, that whatever of yourself you're bringing will be important and valued, and also recognizing that if you don't want to take that invitation, that's also okay, right? You know, I'll just sort of bring a personal example here just to sort of model this from where I am. You know, you'll notice at the beginning of the session, we said you can change your Zoom name. Here are a couple of things you can add there. You know, you can add your location, you can add the phonetic pronunciation of your name, you can add your pronouns, whatever would help you to show up. One thing that we specifically did not say is please include your pronouns in your Zoom name, period. And the reason for that, and you know, you'll notice, like, now that I'm calling attention to it, I'm just going to go there. You'll notice my pronouns aren't in my Zoom name. That's on purpose. And we were able to, you know, as DJA, have some conversations about how do we help people show up in terms of pronouns, in terms of gender identity, without asking people to identify in ways they're currently not, or for past reasons not comfortable showing up. And so thinking about that in a systemic way, right? How do we ask those questions? And this is back to what Lisa was saying, right? We've been sort of trained and indoctrinated with the idea that we have to stay entirely away from these topics so as to stay on the right side of the law, and so as to not create an unsafe environment. Those are some of the ideas there. And so then the dialogue that I've been seeing happening a lot is less about what questions do we ask people individually, probing questions, versus what space are we creating, and what environment are we creating where people can bring what is useful to them, to the group, to others, and allow for, if people don't volunteer information, that's also an okay part of the process. And the last thing I'll say here, and I want us to have some breakout conversations as well as around this, there's a lot to go through. In terms of what we share and what we individually choose to share, and what we create space for sharing of personal information in our workplaces, what is useful? Why is it useful for us to bring something of ourselves into the space? You know, someone had, I think it was Gina mentioning, you know, there are situations in which we might share, like with family, with a particular community, we might let it all hang out. And that's fine, and that's great, and that's what those spaces can be for a lot of people. And but in a professional setting, there's also that same conversation of what is it useful for me, for others to bring to our work in terms of not just how are we showing up, but what structures are we creating and how are we getting our work done? I brought in that personal example because not to just tell you a thing about myself, and I also didn't tell you much about myself, but to point out, I raised that so that we could make better choices as DJA, as a community here today. And so that, I think, is a really helpful way that I was able to bring part of myself, and with a particular purpose. So couple of framing thoughts there.
Perfect, thank you. Trevor.
So, I'm gonna be I'm gonna be the old person in the room, because so Tyler just talked about, and I think and maybe this is the whole question for the discussion today. How do we define a professional setting today? Right? Tyler talked about, you use that word specifically in the professional setting, and I think, although Gina didn't reference it, you talked about your family or other communities, right? And so the professional setting is a community. But I think, in this context, we're talking about the professional community that has been defined by others some long time ago, and that community that we're still living in. And so who's to say that the professional community, thank you, Maggie, is not, that our professional spaces should not be different today than they were, 10 years ago. I'm not, I'm asking the question, I'm not offering an opinion.
First, I love that question. I'm going to debate the oldness in the room because we're the same age. So I say you're like a spring chicken, but I do think that this might be a really perfect time to maybe go into some of these breakout conversations, just to allow for as much voice as possible, but around this specific topic. Like, how are some of these changes showing up as far as the way that we're defining professional spaces, around what some of the either challenges and or opportunities are? So if you look at the mural board, 3 and 5, sections number 3 and 5 ask 2 questions. One are, what are some of the challenges? The other one are, what are some of the opportunities? It doesn't have to be that you limit it to that only, but it might be worthwhile to take just 10 minutes just for allow for kind of a variety, a differentiated way of experiencing this session, to go into a breakout with 8 or so people, have some discussion about what some of these changes are, some of the challenges and opportunities, and then let's come back together again and really come up with some ideas. And I know that there's also additional context that we might also share from Tyler. Okay.
Yeah. So I put that link to the mural back in the chat. Please feel free to join that. And you can double click on any of these post-its to type some text into them. You can also double click anywhere else in a white space to create a new post-it. So we'd love to see your ideas on both those challenges and those opportunities here.
Absolutely.
Sarah, are we set for those breakouts? Oh,
We're all set, and I will send you off to your breakout rooms. If at any point you get confused or get kicked out, I'll be here the whole time to send you back in. Have a good discussion.
10 minutes and then we'll come back. Thank you, everyone. Let's do it.
All right, all right.
Okay, everyone, welcome back. We're just going to show the screen just for a minute, just to remind us what some of the prompts were, and then to kick off a conversation. So some of the things that we invited you to think about were some of the challenges associated with navigating some of the changing expectations as we shift from kind of some ways of being professional in our organizational context to other ways of being in our organizational context, and then some of the opportunities associated with that. And so we can unshare the screen now. Thanks, Tyler, for that. But let's just have a quick discussion. What were like 2 or 3 of the really salient points that surfaced across the different breakout rooms? What were some of the things that really resonated with your group?
our group kind of talked about how it's very different, like people's comfort levels. So like some people might be comfortable with interacting a certain way, but that might put off someone else. So just keeping in mind like those kinds of differences.
Thank you. Ingrid, were you going to say something?
Yes. One of our group members, and I can't find her name now, she pointed out, she made the point, Natalia, about people are messy and kind of having to hold that truth. And it's something that I know I have to remind myself every day when working with so many different people and having so many varied personalities and lifestyles that you're managing. It's like people are messy and I'm messy too. And it's like just having that as like a line of grace through all interactions, I think it's helpful to remember.
Oh, I love it. That line of grace. Yes, that's brilliant. Anyone else?
I would like to add the fact that, because just listening to some of the comments, I think a lot of the attitude is based upon your size of your unit can play a big factor in how your relationship with your staff, because like I say, I was telling them I'm off site and I have a small crew, and we work close together. We even go to lunch together at times and stuff like that. So it's hard not to talk about personal things here and there, but there's always a line you don't want to cross. But I think those that work in those big office environments, it's kind of their situation might be a little different than how those that work in small office environments.
Yeah, that's a good point, Marvin. And over time, the familiarity, if you have some people have a lot of different teams that they work with, 6 different teams that they're members of, and some people have a specific crew that they work with day after day, right? And so the size, the dimension, the nature of the work, the context within which you do the work absolutely is something that plays a role. One of the other things that I just wanted to kind of circle back to and make sure that, there's opportunity for us to at least connect the dots is this idea that Trevor brought up, and it's around the changing definition of professionalism. And I don't know if we've exactly figured out the new definition of professionalism, but there's a lot of conversation about what that word means and how much is implied by the idea of professionalism, whatever the context is. And that, like so many things, that idea, that word, that concept was created for and by certain people in a specific context. And it serves that group in that context well, likely. And as we think about changing workplace environments, understanding of equity, diversity, inclusion, issues and needs as the world continues to change and our environments change, our definitions might really need to be reevaluated and brought to a place where there's more of the values that we currently hold and espouse and want to see present available in those changing definitions or in the changing ways in which we think about professionalism. And then all of the associated ways in which concepts like professionalism play out in our real behaviors and structures. The way that we coach, the way that we hire, the way that we mentor, the way that we advance, the way that we promote, the way that we center other people's reality and create shared space for power dynamics to exist differently than they have. There's so many opportunities for us to take one specific concept, really start thinking about its redefinition and reconceptualization, and then all of the ways in which that redefinition and reconceptualization is and should show up in our current and future behaviors and structures. So I just want to thank you, Trevor, for bringing up that really, speaking of complicated, a really complicated issue, but it's a really important one for us. Trevor, back to you.
Yeah, so, really, indeed, very complicated. And just talking about how we show up in our small group, we talked about, cultural appropriation, Reverend Greg mentioned that. And so someone may show up in a way that is, displeasing or uncomfortable, or just like, what are you doing, to someone else. But also more specifically as specifically on this professional versus maybe not professional. I mean, Eric and I are often in the same space, and I noticed that neither of us is wearing a tie today, right? But in all the spaces where we traditionally are, we're both wearing ties, right? Because that's the professional expectation of us in the roles that we have in our organizations. But that has changed significantly over the last year when we were working in different ways. And will that part of being professional continue to be in effect, a year from now? I guess we'll see, Eric, right? Are we going to go back to ties and suits, maybe even, or will we continue to dress in less formal ways, because this is now the next norm in terms of that aspect of being professional. It used to be, if you don't dress a certain, just the way you dress commands a certain level of respect or authority or something. I don't know what people thought that would project, but here we are in a different circumstance, and we're still doing what we do.
Good example. Thank you, Trevor. Beth, and then Tyler, we'll ask you to tell us more about context collapse. Beth.
Thanks. I just wanted to jump in about the dress. I mean, I've always been someone in my 20-some years that dressed much more casually. And then as I get in leadership roles, I'm probably more casual than most. But I just kind of want to name the fact that what's tough is what's been pointed out to me over the years is I'm a white person. I can get away with my white privilege and be a little less formal, right? I can wear a t-shirt, and I've been told by friends of color that it's harder for them to do that. They have to feel in our, white privileged society, that they have to dress differently and can't get away with it. So there's that whole dynamic there. I know we've talked about it, but that still keeps resonating with me personally as I've tried to push against, like, I do a good job, why do I have to dress a certain way? But there are those issues as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Beth.
Absolutely.
Super important. Yeah.
Yeah, I really appreciate that we're having this conversation here, in that, professionalism as a concept is fundamentally about who is a part of us versus them, who deserves to be a part of us, who commands that respect, right? And there are a lot of different aspects of that, right? That, for me as a white person, I can show up in ways that Dieta couldn't. For me as a queer person, Dieta can show up in some ways that I can't. And so the way that professionalism is defined, one, and Dieta, you pointed to this, professionalism is defined by the professionals, capital P. And by those with that privilege of saying, here's what the standards are to be a part of us. And there's a lot of privilege there and a lot of power there to make those definitions and to also adjust those definitions over time. I don't think we're going to get to a place, nor do I think it's desirable for us to have no sense of who we are, but what that sense is and how that's defined, that's the really interesting question. And for a lot of us in the room, I know a lot of us are in those positions of power to set, like, what are the standards? What are the things that I'm going to bring up? Am I going to bring up that an employee isn't wearing a tie? In what context might I do that? Those are questions that we get to ask ourselves, and we have an opportunity. So I want to draw us to a different concept in our last few minutes. We're not going to get a chance to discuss fully, but I think that's fine. I'm going to bring us back to our mural really quick just to have an illustration here. I want to bring in this concept concept of context collapse. Now, this term comes out of technology studies and social media studies. The originator of that, Dana Boyd, this term, context collapse, is thinking about that in the sense of, as we have begun to have social media, the internet, globalization of communication, the places where we find ourselves communicating with people suddenly have a lot of different kinds of people and kinds of relationships in one place, right? For those of us who are on Facebook, you're probably Facebook friends with family, with friends, with coworkers, with neighbors, with people you don't know. And so now you have to decide, what can I put into this space, knowing that there are a lot more eyes and a lot more kinds of eyes watching that. And suddenly we end up like this poor person here with just a ton of post-its on our face, right? We're trying to communicate a bunch of different messages. We're having a bunch of different messages thrown at us, and they all collide with each other. Where I want to extend that concept a little bit, I alluded to this earlier, as we're in the midst of COVID and suddenly our office is our dining room, is our bedroom, is the place we spend time with many different kinds of people as floating heads on a Zoom screen. We also are experiencing a kind of context collapse where the person who I am right now is going to be different from the person I am in my next Zoom call, but here I am in this same place, in this same social feeling context. And I think we're going to have a lot more of that dialogue, especially as we are transitioning back into physical spaces a lot of the time, where we need to recognize that, the context that we find ourselves in, those are going to collide with each other in new and different and exciting ways. I don't think that's going to slow down. And to go back to what I think Ingrid brought up from Natalia, was around the grace that we can extend to each other, recognizing that people are messy. I think the really interesting question for us as we go forward is around knowing that our contexts collapse all the time, and knowing that some parts of ourselves are private and should be private, right? The expectation isn't that we share everything with everyone. And in most cases, people don't do that, even if they're sharing things that we think might be unprofessional. They're probably bringing that up for a reason. And so the question for us is, what do we take from what people are sharing? What do we share ourselves? And what purpose does that serve in bringing us towards some shared values where we get to have those conversations around what does it mean for us to be professional in this space? And how do we want to make that arrangement with each other? Can we have some conversations around that? And so thank you all for entering into some really detailed conversations around that today. I think this has been really enlightening for me to hear all of your perspectives. Yeah, Dieta, do you have anything you wanted to add?
No, I think it's really wonderful. And I love even how Steve kind of brought this vulnerable and still private, right? Like that's and I absolutely think the answer is yes. I absolutely think, right? And vulnerable means that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm sharing information that I don't choose to share, right? But there's sometimes information that I choose to share that still makes me feel vulnerable, maybe because it's power dynamics that are differentiated, because it's new, because I'm not sure how it's going to be received. But it's not necessarily something that I'm being forced to share or that I feel is absolutely private, as in inappropriate, or I don't think that it will serve the space well. But I do feel like there's more and more opportunity, especially as we continue to redefine our spaces together, to really have more explicit conversations about what this space will look like. What do we mean when we talk about safe space or brave space or shared space? What does that mean? And just sometimes calling the question is a great place to start. Okay, folks, Do we want to explicitly talk about the space that we want to be in together? How do we want to make sure that we are surfacing our assumptions about what's going to be new or different now and in the future versus the way that we operated in the past? Are there things that we want to explicitly change about how it is that we're working together going forward? Are there certain things that we want to explicitly commit to keeping the same because they worked well for us and we honor them? And how is it that power dynamics are having an impact on how we show up? And how is it that we can create more evenness as far as power distribution in our space together and as we go forward? But sometimes just asking those questions, not necessarily feeling like we have to have the official answer to them, is a wonderful place to get started with conversations like this. And then to also make sure that we're having kind of shared assumptions and agreements about how we want to navigate these new environments. With that said, Sarah, can you show the screen, or sorry, Tyler, can you show your screen one more time just so that we can kind of end on the same page here? So some of the takeaways that, hopefully are resonating with you from this course is that, or from this session, is that we want to actively manage, and the word active is the most important part, right? That we're actively willing to initiate conversation and be in conversation about how it is that we want to engage with each other. That explicit space to talk about how we want to talk with each other and what our expectations are is the major opportunity. That there are absolutely kind of formal facilitation techniques that you can use to ensure kind of evenness of access and participation. Things like setting group norms, or using like a round robin technique to invite different people to share, or sharing with your agenda, sharing the agenda in advance so that people are able to decide how much or how little of a specific question or element or team builder or icebreaker they want to prepare themselves to share, so that people are able to come to this space and able to engage, but at a level that is able to really be driven by them. The other thing that would really be useful to remember and take away from this is that invitation language that Tyler introduced earlier, right? And creating space oftentimes is about inviting, but not necessarily expecting people to show up in ways that we ourselves might be willing to present to a group. A couple of things that we'd love to just keep on your radar, get on your radar, that there is a session coming up in June 24th. So our next Inclusive Managers Series free webinar similar to this is going to happen again on June 24th at 11 a.m. Eastern. We're going to be joined by Dr. Jerome Offer Jr., who is the new Associate University Librarian for Anti-Racism at Harvard University. And we're going to talk about building an anti-racism strategy. We talked about anti-racism about a month ago with another colleague of ours. But this is such a big topic, and there are so many dimensions that we really want to make sure that we have plenty of opportunity to think about strategy and different perspectives and voices and tools. The last thing that we want to make sure that you have on your radar is that the Inclusive Managers Toolkit, our signature 10-week course, is beginning in September. And so if you'd like to register to be part of that experience, we would absolutely love to have you. And you can register at our website, which is DeettaJones.com, or just let any of us know on this call, Tyler, Lexi, Sarah, or myself, if any of us can be helpful with helping you get additional information about that program. Thank you all so much for being here and for continuing to invest in doing your own work. And we'd love to continue to be partners and collaborators with you. We'll make sure that this recording is up on the YouTube channel, and we'll send it to you via email so that you can forward it to colleagues if you'd like. And if there's any other topics that you think would really be important for us to delve into, please just let us know. We'd love to make sure that the topics are really relevant to you and meaningful for you. Okay.
Definitely. Yeah, thank you all so much. This was a fabulous conversation, and I want to acknowledge a couple of things in the chat. One, thank you, Sarah, for putting the link to that next session. Also, I saw the question from Jeffrey, are we able to save or get a copy of the mural information for continued reference and thinking? That link that the mural is at is, and I'm just going to, oh, that's not the right link at all. I'm going to put that link back in the chat for the mural. That mural is going to stay up, so please feel free to use that link. Download a copy, whatever is useful.
And we'll also create a PDF of it and send it as a follow-up email so that you have easy access. Okay.
All right.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. We'll see you soon.
Well, happy Friday Eve.